Hi, everyone. This is Jeff Praissman with Interactive Brokers Podcast. It's my pleasure to welcome back to IBKR Podcast Studio, Nasdaq's Michael Normyle. How are you, Michael?
Hi, doing well. Glad to be back. Thanks.
Love having you come in for our monthly podcast talking about the economy and all other things. And for our listeners, before we even get started, you can find more from Michael on Nasdaq's website and then also on our own website under education. Plenty of podcasts, webinars, articles, and so forth. Michael, today we're going to kind of talk about something a little bit different than our typical economic, discussions. And we're going to kind of, we both read the same article. It's what if remote working, not AI, is to blame for, weak junior hiring by John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times. And I wanted to ask you, like, just to kind of kick it off, how convincing is the case that remote work, not AI, is the primary driver of the decline in the entry-level hiring?
Yeah, so I think the premise of the article is pretty surprising since a lot of people in recent years they've pointed to recent labor market weakness, and especially among younger workers, and how that's lined up with the advent of generative AI, and then making the link that AI is somehow responsible for this weakness in hiring, especially among younger workers. But so this article, it cites a study, The Broken Ladder by Lambert and Schindler. And I think it makes a pretty convincing statistical, but also logical case that remote work is actually the main driver of this weaker entry level hiring. So, in terms of the statistical evidence, they analyzed 243 million new hires and 407 million job postings across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia from 2017 to 2025. And then they paired that with the exposures to Gen AI and remote work by the occupations of those hires and postings. And so using that data, they found that when you test AI exposure and remote work exposure separately, they both predict roughly the same decline in junior hiring. But then when you put both of those variables in the same model at the same time, the AI effect basically disappears while that remote work effect holds firm. And that pattern survives across every variation of the model they did, different countries, different industries, different ways of measuring AI exposure, different statistical methods. And so then this whole modeled finding is made more credible when they go the extra step to say it's not just about exposure. They also tested what happened at firms that actually adopted remote work in 2021 and 2022, and then found that the results mirrored those modeled results. So a lot of evidence here to show that really remote work may be the bigger culprit than AI in this decline in junior hiring that we've seen across four major economies.
But what was interesting too, though, is it seemed to kind of disproportionately reduce demand for junior workers while leaving senior hiring relatively unaffected. Why do you think remote work is kind of having that effect on the two different kind of lifespans in your employment history, basically?
Yeah, and I think this gets to the kind of logical explanation that I alluded to,
Mhm.
that it comes down to the fact that early career workers need more supervision than experienced hires. And they develop skills, they acquire knowledge, they build relationships in the workplace by observing and working alongside more experienced workers. Doing this remotely, it's definitely possible, but there's more friction in that process. So then it takes more time from senior workers because there's these extra frictions. It's costlier to bring on these junior workers in that sense that it takes them longer to develop. And then from the junior worker perspective, if your development is extended, then that may mean it takes you longer to get promoted. And so none of that logic applies to hiring a senior worker. They already have the skills, they need less handholding, and they can kind of hit the ground running comparatively. And so that makes the calculus for senior hires essentially unchanged, while it becomes less favorable for those junior hires.
And you mentioned earlier sort of the studies where they're having AI exposure and then remote work, and then but once sort of remote work was introduced and factored in, that kind of AI exposure sort of kind of went away. So what was the evidence that suggested that the link between AI exposure and the weak junior hiring breaks down once the remote work is factored in?
Yeah, and that's really the most interesting piece of the puzzle here. And the authors, they call it an omitted variable bias problem. And that's just because a lot of AI heavy jobs, AI exposed jobs like software developers, management consultants, data scientists, they're also the jobs that are most amenable to remote work. And so if you only look at AI exposure in your model, you might actually be picking up the remote work effect at the same time. And so when you have them work from home exposure and AI exposure being highly correlated, when you have that model only testing the Gen AI impact, then Gen AI looks responsible. But then when you control for remote work, that's why you see the AI impact largely disappear while the work from home impact pretty much holds.
And there's also some specific fields where, remote work really seemed to hurt in junior hiring, like tech and law. Why are there certain fields like those that seem more affected by weaker hiring in junior roles?
Yeah, and this kind of makes the case, I think, when you look at those two sectors for remote work being perhaps the bigger culprit
Mhm.
than AI, because in tech, the conventional narrative really has been that AI is taking these coding jobs because it's such it's so well suited towards coding, and especially at the junior level. But coding, it's also one of the most remote friendly jobs out there. And so in the Lambert and Schindler study, when they control for that, that AI explanation really weakens. The junior hiring slowdown in tech looks a lot more like a remote work story than an AI story. And then legal work, it's less exposed to AI than like software development, for example,
Mhm.
because lawyers, they're not being replaced by code generators at the same rate Gen AI models. But legal work is also very amenable to remote work. And so, especially for more like knowledge workers, like corporate lawyers. And so, junior hiring in law has also come down quite sharply. And so that's what you'd expect if it were remote work being the driver, not AI. So you're seeing that decline in both industries. And that's kind of what's pointing to really remote work being the bigger factor than AI.
So let's take AI kind of completely out of picture and can I just talk about the contrast between because it seems like there's basically remote friendly roles and there's and kind of in-person friendly roles. And sort of the contrast between them, like is that what's really driving these hiring trends?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and this is kind of this kind of post-COVID period is like effectively a natural experiment to this question. So if you look at receptionists, for example, which
Mm,
is a role that's got quite a lot of AI exposure because AI can automate scheduling and those types of things, but it's also inherently an in-person job. Junior hiring for receptionists has actually held up quite well compared to more remote work exposed roles. And when you contrast that with like a lawyer or financial analyst, where there's less AI exposure perhaps, but the roles are more heavily remote, that's where we've seen junior hiring come down. And so that's really the exact opposite pattern of what you had seen if you thought that the dominant narrative of AI replacing junior workers was really true. And so, if AI were the main driver, you'd expect that those most AI exposed roles would suffer the most, but the data shows it's really the most remote work roles that are being impacted. And I think the interesting thing that adds to the case of the paper is showing that this is happening across very different labor markets, right? I mentioned we looked at the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. And across those four different countries, four different labor markets, we see the same pattern where essentially junior share of new hires is down 8 to 11 percentage points relative to the 2019 baseline. And of course, comparing it to 2019 makes sense because that's really before we saw this massive increase in remote work and also Gen AI. And so that's really where you get the case that it's work from home exposure, not AI exposure. That's really most responsible.
and I think one thing people don't necessarily think about is just sort of the cost and complexity of onboarding and training, junior employees. Does remote work increase that cost or lower that cost?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it, I think, a little bit in our earlier discussion
Mm,
here, but for everyone who's worked in an office before, I think you realize that a lot of the benefit is informal, where you overhear a senior colleague dealing with like a difficult client call, or you get pulled into a meeting and you see how these decisions are being made, or you
mhm.
ask a quick question at somebody's desk and you have an answer in 30 seconds. And that's not stuff that's as natural in a remote environment. And I think the paper cites some research showing that remote work does raise the cost of supervising and monitoring workers and slows on the job learning. So one study they cite found in-person onboarding raised labor productivity and reduced attrition, even at firms that are otherwise remote. So just doing onboarding in person. And then another found just one office day per month relative to fully remote raises productivity and increases communication between workers and managers. So it's a pretty low bar that they're setting here in these studies. So from the firm's perspective, though you're paying these entry level workers a salary while they're still on the learning curve and you're
Mhm.
spending senior managers time managing and teaching them. And so there's uncertainty about when the payoff is going to happen really. And so that's really the challenge where remote work maybe extends that process and makes it less appetizing for businesses to hire these junior workers in a relative sense here.
So I would imagine also that companies are, yeah, they probably have to be a little bit more selective now with entry level hiring too, right? Because remote work is really, as you said, it's making it a little bit hard. It's making probably more than a little bit harder to train and evaluate the junior talent since they're not kind of seeing them in person every day.
Yeah, and I think that's what the data is suggesting here. It's not that we're just seeing
Mm.
fewer junior hires. We're seeing job postings raising the bar for experience. So the study's tracking not just who gets hired, but what also employers are asking for in their job ads. And so by 2025, there's been about a 3 percentage point decline in the share of job postings requiring 3 years of experience or less among those high remote work jobs. And so that's companies shifting to focusing on workers with a little bit more work experience where maybe there's less handholding needed and stuff like that. And the FT article does make another suggestion for what could be the cause here. So companies that struggled to train and manage remote junior workers, they may start setting a higher bar for that
Mhm.
hiring. And then when those posts maybe don't get filled, then they can see compounds. And that's the kind of trend that we're seeing here. So that's could see a bit of a self-reinforcing cycle where there's fewer posting, fewer hires, and then fewer junior workers as well.
And the one thing, the article also, I was a little surprised by this when I first read it, but after thinking about it, it really makes a lot of sense. It suggests that younger workers are really not that enthusiastic about fully remote roles. I think that's something that maybe the younger workers are maybe getting a little bit of a bad rap, or people that don't have exposure to them. They think, oh, all these right out of college kids want fully remote roles. And actually seems to be quite the opposite, right?
Yeah, and I think you make a great point there where that might be the kind of perception, but that differs from the reality where I think also makes sense when you think about it, where these maybe Gen Z workers, they understand that they need to get this work experience, they need to get trained. And so it's in their best interest to not have these fully remote jobs. And so the the data that the article is citing here is from a Gallup poll, and it found that Gen Z is actually the generation most opposed to fully remote work. So only 23% of Gen Z prefer fully remote compared to 35% each for millennials, Gen Z or Gen X, excuse me, and boomers.
Mhm.
And then Gen Z, they instead prefer hybrid at the highest rate, which is 71%. And then boomers prefer fully in person at the highest rate, but that's just 10%. So in general, across the board, people tend to prefer hybrid work environment at the biggest rate here. And the Gallup poll did suggest that there's a few reasons for this, at least in their interpretation. And the first is just that Gen Z, they're least likely to be parents. And so the survey showed 39% of parents born after 1989 prefer
Mhm.
fully remote compared to 29% for non-parents in that same age group. So just if you're a parent with younger kids, it's a bit easier to have that flexibility of fully remote. But another factor being that Gen Z feels the loneliest while working remotely, with 27% of them compared to 21% for millennials, 15% for Gen X, and 10% for baby boomers, which also might be related to the fact that maybe you don't have, a partner at home or a child at home and things like
Mhm.
that. So there's a few different factors that come down to that reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, hybrid work really does seem like a nice middle ground. Sort of, you get that in-person structure, but also you get that opportunity to, yeah, work from home a day or two a week, and sort of be able to sort of have that work-life balance as well. Not dealing with a commute if you have a longer commute, or being able to, if you have younger children, being able to kind of make sure that you can get them from school or whatever you need to do. Michael, beyond remote work and AI, are there other structural factors that are making it harder for recent graduates to enter the workforce?
Yeah, and I think it's a bit beyond the scope of this paper. So I'll just kind of give
Mhm.
you my thoughts. And they're not even so much structural factors as more somewhat cyclical. So the paper is looking at hiring relative to 2019, and they see that about 8 to 10% decline in the junior share of new hires since 2019. And that's across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. And so these are all economies that saw relatively large rate hike cycles in the last few years that were designed to cool off the labor market and inflation. And so that doesn't explain the drop in the share of junior hires, but I think the softer labor market does make it easier for companies to be pickier and perhaps opt for a person that has some more experience. So maybe you were considering a junior hire, but you could maybe, you're getting people applying that maybe have a few more years of experience or something like that. So that's an option for you. And plus, with hiring having slowed, we've definitely seen people staying on their jobs longer, at least in the US. And so that means fewer openings. And it might be the case more where people are waiting until they have a new job in hand before they quit a current job. So might be some factors that are also contributing here.
And how should companies rethink training and development if hybrid work really becomes the sort of the long-term norm, which it probably will, sort of that middle ground?
Yeah, and I think the paper is pretty direct on this. And
Mm,
so essentially the authors argue if it is remote work rather than AI, that's the main driver of this decline in junior hiring. That actually makes the solution a lot simpler, right? Because you don't need wage subsidies, you don't need universal basic income or
mm.
some kind of AI tax policy. You just need better management practices that are adapted to these hybrid environments. And so that just means being more intentional about these things that used to happen organically in the office, whether it's structured mentorship programs, deliberate knowledge sharing sessions, clear onboarding tracks for remote or hybrid junior hires. And so that means that you're making sure that the 1 or 2 days or maybe 3 days in person each week are actually used for the high bandwidth interactions that benefit these junior workers and not just work that could have been done at home anyway.
Got it. And probably the most important question for our listeners, especially our younger ones, this weakness in junior hiring, do you think this is going to be, is this cyclical or is this sort of a longer term structural shift? I mean, my personal opinion is at some point, like we got to hire someone. Like there's the older experienced workers are going to age out at some point. So I hope it's more cyclical than long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on the research, it does look reasonably structural in this sense. But getting back to our last discussion here, it's something that can be fixed. And
Right.
so it just requires companies to adopt these strategies that make the mentorship and hiring and onboarding and training of remote
Mhm.
worker or junior workers better relative than the processes that are in place currently. And once I think we see that, that's where we start to see the share of junior hires rebound. So I don't think it's like an overnight change that we're going to see, but I think there's definitely a path to a rebound in the share of junior hires once these changes are more broadly adopted to account for this environment. And I think it's also something that companies are kind of going to figure out just as they're getting more practice with it, right? So it's been a few years at this point, and I'm sure companies are making improvements on that front already.
Michael, as always, this has been great for our listeners. You can find more from Michael on our website, interactivebrokers.com, under education, or at Nasdaq.com. Michael, thanks again. Love having you coming in here for our monthly discussions on the economy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Glad to be back.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell, or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives, or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.